I think it would be to make sure you really want to do it and are willing to put 120% of yourself into it. Career changes and career changes in general, but I think a career change into UX requires a lot of sacrifice and even more work. But it's just making sure that you really want to do it and are willing to go super hard at it and make those sacrifices.
Hello and welcome to UX Transitions, where I talk with guests who have made a career change into UX. I'm Robert Crane. My guest today grew up in the suburbs of New York. He holds a bachelor degree in international studies, started his career in marketing and communications, worked in various roles in fashion, and has been working as a product designer for more than 2 years. Welcome, Eli Handler.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the first question. What is UX and why does it matter?
Yeah, UX is most simply how people interact with either a product or service. Defines how a product, service, or business is for a person, how it works for them, makes them feel. And to answer the second part of the question, I think it matters because it's critical for helping people achieve what they need to accomplish, but also in business for cultivating lasting relationships with users, as well as in most cases, driving conversion. I think businesses have always emphasized UX because of how important it is. I think it might have just been packaged differently maybe a few years ago compared to what it is today. Now it's a full industry and it's a full job title, but I think UX is such a critical part of an entire business that I think businesses or people running businesses or teams definitely emphasize how important it is.
Let's go a little bit back in your history. So you're from New York. In what
Yep.
ways did growing up in the New York suburbs shape your identity and influence the choices you've made in your career?
Yeah. Um, so I grew up in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County, which is not far from the city. And I think that that had a pretty enormous impact in shaping who I am today. Irvington is right on the Hudson River. It is a relatively green suburb. It's really beautiful. And so I had a lot of access to nature, which is one of my true loves and is a big part of who I am. But as mentioned, it's super close to the city, which is the epicenter for the majority of my biggest interests, whether it's like art, music, design, fashion, general culture, etc. So having such close access to that and the fast-paced nature of the city, but being rooted in Irvington, New York, and that nature and the slower-ish pace of life definitely shaped who I am today, I think. Um, Sort of having that blending of both of those worlds, the suburb world and the city world, definitely had a massive impact. But regarding the choices I've made in my career, like you asked, I would definitely say it had a pretty decent influence. Um, like I mentioned, New York is the epicenter of so many of my biggest interests, and for the most part in my career, I've worked primarily within industry surrounding those interests. So yeah, definitely.
And before you transitioned to UX, you have worked in fashion in various roles for very notable brands. When did you realize that UX could be a valid career option? And what were your expectations back then?
Yeah, great question. I would probably say um, I started thinking about UX as a career option in 2020 mainly during COVID. I'd been working in the fashion industry for about 4 years at that time and was affected by a hiring freeze. And so I was unemployed for a couple of months and was having trouble getting another job in fashion because it's such an in-person role. Um, but I love fashion, always have and always will. So I wanted to see that through at the time. However, I always felt like I wanted something more intellectually challenging as well as stimulating. Um, I'd always been drawn to design, but I'd gotten a little frustrated with the fashion industry in many ways, other than just me having trouble getting a job at that time. And then started thinking about what might be next for me. And then I explored UX and web design and was super drawn to it.
And when you started your UX journey, you chose a UX bootcamp. Why is that?
To be honest, probably because it was the most cost effective and time efficient in terms of an educational experience. When I dive into something, I really like to dive in head first and go all in and try to learn everything as much as possible or as quickly as possible, just so I can get started as soon as possible. So that's why I gravitated towards a UX boot camp. But yeah, at the same time, I transitioned to working on the web and e-commerce side for the business I was working for, and then also freelanced at a startup. Just going on top of the point of just fully wanting to dive into things, which I think a boot camp allows you to do.
And in your previous work experience in communication and also fashion, you demonstrate an affinity for visual art and design. Do you think that this experience gave you a head start in mastering the design aspects of the UX process during your UX bootcamp? Or did you had a feeling
Yeah,
that you had to learn design really from the ground up?
no, I think it did. I've always been a very visual person. I didn't think I've always had a solid basis for good design. So I think that set a pretty solid foundation for me as I got into everything. But of course, when I started, I was such a rookie. Um, so I had that basis, but when I was doing the boot camp, I made sure to go super hard on understanding the UX UI basics. Like when we were working together, but then also really made sure to go super hard on learning the basics of typography, color theory. Um, but yeah, I mean, honestly, to this day, I'm still trying to go super hard on learning as much as I can, or just practicing those skills.
And of course, research also plays an important part in the UX process. How challenging was it for you to master that part? And especially looking at interviewing people and extracting usable insights for design solutions, because I guess that was maybe pretty new.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was particularly challenging for me. I like talking to people and diving deep on kind of understanding problems and how people achieve certain tasks. Um, if it's clear what you're trying to learn from people to help inform whatever it is you're trying to do, I don't think research is that challenging. It's like if you make sure to prepare and really understand what you're trying to get to the bottom of. But of course, like with everything, practice is key. And so, when I first got started, I was obviously such a rookie, but I feel like I learned that pretty quickly. Otherwise, you're wasting your own time, you're wasting other people's time. Yeah,
And by the end of the UX bootcamp, you have, of course, to deliver a portfolio. It's probably most of the most important proof of your UX capabilities. What steps did you take to make your portfolio successful? And what changes or additions did you implement while searching for jobs?
Whew. Um, yeah, the portfolio is critical, obviously, as you know, um, since it's literally what everybody looks at to evaluate your capabilities, your qualifications, etc. I worked on my first portfolio for like 100 plus hours. I probably worked on it for too long, but I think as I started to really get knee deep in the job hunt, I was constantly trying to simplify it and pare it back, not trying to go super hard in the process and all the inner workings that you want to show. I think for the most part, when you're applying for jobs, that should just be something that you already know. So you don't need to just put it all in front of everybody in your case studies for your portfolio. You just got to pare it back and get right to the point. And I guess one thing I would add
Mm-hmm.
too is just when I was applying to certain jobs, while I was pretty much a rookie and didn't have so much experience to show, I was definitely always trying to curate my portfolio to be specific towards particular jobs that I wanted. I think that helped get me to where I need to be.
Looking back at your UX bootcamp journey, what do you consider the highs and the lows in that journey?
I think like for me, the highs were getting to build your network with other designers. So meeting people like you, meeting other mentors I'd worked with, meeting other students. In some cases, collaborating with other students was a high. Also, just seeing yourself get better as you practice was a high. I think the lows are probably the mental aspects, like the self doubt or just the imposter syndrome. I feel like when you're changing your career, especially in your 20s or your late 20s, etc., you have to be very vulnerable. You have to make a lot of sacrifices, and I think that can affect you mentally. And I'm sure it affects a lot of designers mentally. It definitely did for me. So I think that was probably I would consider like the low.
And do you feel that the UX bootcamp prepared you for your job hunt, especially in the time when you were looking for a job?
I think so. Like I mentioned, I think it provided, or maybe I didn't mention this, but it provided like the core basics. But I don't think UX boot camps will ever solely get you a job. Like UX boot camps alone, you have to apply your learning super hardcore, network like crazy, and really put yourself out there. Um, I think that probably the boot camp was responsible for like 25, 30% of me getting a job. I think applying those learnings. So transitioning to working in web and e-commerce for the business I was working for, just having that tangential experience, and also working like freelancing for a startup and just pretty much working for free just to apply my learnings and gain experience. Um, Plus networking really actually got me there.
After you have finished the UX bootcamp, did you give yourself a time limit to find a UX role? Or did you maybe even had a backup plan in the case you couldn't find a job in UX?
I wouldn't say I had a time limit. I was definitely just trying to get a job as soon as possible. When I finished my UX bootcamp, I was still working full time. And I think that was challenging for me because I was trying to finish a portfolio and really just dive in on becoming a product designer and thinking, breathing that world while having a foot still in kind of like the previous world I was working in, which was the fashion industry. So I didn't really have a time limit, but I was probably looking for a job, I would say for about 5 to 6 months. And honestly, for 2 of those months, I quit my job to focus full time on getting that product design job to making that transition. I didn't really have a backup plan just because I was moving so headfirst and just making sure it would happen for me. Um, I don't think I had a time limit like, oh, if I don't get a job by this day, I'm just going to give up. I feel like I was, I am and was at the time too young to be thinking that way. I do think if it had gotten to a certain point, I probably would have picked up like a side job or a service job, just bring in some income while I was looking for the job. But I was just never going to give up. I was like, this is what I'm going to do.
I didn't know that you quit your job and spent full time on looking for a job. That's pretty
Yeah.
hardcore. Did your anxiety level didn't that go through the roof?
Um, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a really scary and risky time period in hindsight. It's like I had quit my job, and luckily I was living at my friend's place, and in the relative sense of New York City rent, wasn't paying that much. But I literally had $5,000 to $6,000 saved up to just like hold me over during this period with no income. So I really had to constrain my lifestyle like super significantly just to try to stretch it as long as possible. Um, but yeah, like I said, I was super dedicated to making sure that this was going to happen by any means necessary, and luckily it did. Otherwise, yeah, I probably would have figured out something to do on the side while I still worked at it. Scary, but
You got your first project or your first role. What were the biggest challenges that you faced during that time, and how did you overcome them?
probably just establishing myself as a design, like as a product designer that a big company could trust to take on important tasks or just tasks alone. When I started, I was the second product designer at the company below a pretty senior product designer. And understandably, when I started, he was handling pretty much all of the the biggest projects. I was just assisting him. But yeah, ultimately, I just put my hand up to take on any task I could and just worked super hard and consistently to try to practice and prove myself and just work and make mistakes and learn from them and push forward. So that was probably my biggest challenge. But on top of that, I'll just say um, a couple months after I started uh, at my first job, the other designer at the company left and a replacement was never hired. So I basically had to fill their shoes and my shoes, which was an incredible opportunity for me because I basically was thrust into this role of having to really take on and manage and lead all these projects. And I grew exponentially as a designer from having that opportunity. I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity. Um, but yeah, just to not veer off too much and go back to your original question, I would just say that like proving myself and establishing myself was the biggest challenge.
That's very interesting because normally a senior role or senior product designer works as a filter between the stakeholder and you. Now, in the situation that you just described, that person is gone. Now, all of a sudden, all the stakeholder pressure is on you. How did you handle that in the beginning?
The company where I'm working, it's a very sink or swim environment. I just kind of worked really hard, tried to make sure I was as thorough as possible, was very direct and specific in trying to communicate what I'm working on or questions I had, how everything would affect the bottom line or would help push the business forward. Obviously, it's never perfect. You have your bumps along the road. But yeah, I just kind of thrust myself into it and it was very sink or swim. Luckily, I had had a lot of experience working with the heads of companies from my previous roles, and that definitely helped me when I was in that position and still am in that position. But yeah, it was definitely it definitely had its challenges, but you learn and you go and just always keep pushing forward, I guess. Yeah.
A few product designers I've interviewed before mentioned that their past work experience is closely aligned with their current roles and even have laid the groundwork for their success. Did your previous experience influence your role as a product designer?
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, going back to our the first couple of questions, UX is relevant in every field and in every industry. It's important. It's paramount to understand who's using your product or service or who's interacting with your business in order to create a strong product or service, but also to help a business succeed. Um, while I wasn't doing UX design, a lot of my previous roles, or sorry, in any of my previous roles, I think I applied the learnings or methods of thinking about who your consumer is or who the users are, trying to cultivate the best experience possible for them um, in ways that help them, but also help the business. Even if it wasn't design, I think that method of thinking, yeah, has definitely been influential in my current role as a product designer.
And when you look back at your journey as a product designer, starting from the beginning and to the point that we are now, where do you see the most growth in your development as a product designer?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I think it was having the opportunity to quote unquote be a lead designer for the company I'm working at. And I'm really just being thrust into that role of having to like take on and manage a bunch of huge tasks and projects at a really fast pace. That no doubt was the biggest learning or the biggest growth moment for me as a product designer.
And my last question: what advice would you give to people who are considering a career change into UX?
I think it would be to make sure you really want to do it and are willing to put 120% of yourself into it. Career changes and career changes in general, but I think a career change into UX requires a lot of sacrifice and even more work. It's such a competitive world, and it's also very fast paced. It's hard to establish yourself. I think that I'm still in that part of my career. I definitely am, but it's just making sure that you really want to do it and are willing to go super hard at it and make those sacrifices. And then on top of that, I would just say, just try to put yourself out there as much as possible. Network like crazy. It's like at the end of the day, networking is everything. Um, so that I would put a lot of emphasis on it. But then also to just kind of like believe in yourself and not take no for an answer. Well, not take no, I would say like for your own self. In a career transition, you're always going to doubt yourself or always second guess, but just to try to keep that North Star of knowing that you made the right decision if you actually want to do this and that you can do it and you will get there is super important. And I think that that's what helped me.
That's very good advice, Eli. Thank you so much.
Of
Eli
course.
Handler, thank you for your time today. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast or have any
Thank,
feedback, please leave a message. I wish you all the best in your journey and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.